So after a pretty good run in the last few rounds, winning 3 consecutive games, I'm now playing against FIDE Master Felix Xie from New Zealand, and Felix is basically known for, or at least this is what I know him for being pretty booked up. I saw him play against one of my other friends in an earlier round. There was some like Night-Off where he blitzed out like 20 moves of prep, and there really wasn't that much time to prepare for this game, at least if I recall correctly. I think this was, well, the second round of the day, and there was maybe like 10 minutes in between when the parents came out and when the round actually started, or maybe it was a bit more, I forget, but basically not a whole lot of time to prepare, and I stick to 1 d4 for this game, but in this position, instead of going for c4, I go for 2 knight f3, and one of my ideas is that with Felix, I know that he has been playing the Grunfeld quite a bit recently, at least from what I recall, that's what he was doing, but against me, he decided to go for e6, which probably indicates that he has done some prep against the Catalan, which I usually play after g3. I actually saw earlier this tournament, he played some line with like bishop b4 check, bishop d2, a5, which is a line that has seen a bit of a revival in recent years, but I had a feeling he'd probably prepare something different for this game, and that's why in this position I did something which is very normal, but at least for me is a bit unusual, and I play knight to c3. And Felix took a bit of a think here, and I'd seen from his previous games at the very least that usually when he reaches this position, he'd go bishop e7, go for a queen's gambit declined, but the reason he did not play this is because he also knew that I basically never play knight c3, and so he was we were basically playing this mutual game of complete mindfuckery with each other where I don't really, I know some positions after knight c3 by transposition, if for example we go into a semi-Slav. I've studied this a bit before from white's perspective. Rogozin, I play this with black, so I can probably also play it with white. Semi-Tarach, I also can sort of handle this, but he ends up going for this move after a bit of thinking. D takes c4. You can see he spent 5 minutes on this move, which is a perfectly theoretical move, just grabbing a pawn. This is called the Vienna opening. Don't confuse this with the other Vienna, which is after e4, e5, knight c3. This is a very different opening, of course, and basically the idea is you grab a pawn, you ask white what the hell they're going to do, and if they go for the most principled move, e4, usually you go bishop b4, and there's a sort of theory where white plays bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, castles, and there's this line where black shouldn't grab another pawn, I forget why, but they play bishop e7, and you basically get this position where white is down a pawn, but had pretty decent compensation. But to be honest, I wasn't so confident to go into that line because I've never really studied it properly before from the white perspective. I assume there's actual nuances you need to know to prove that you have compensation for the pawn and not just lose. Not to mention after e4, there's another weird line which has also become somewhat trendy, which is to go b5 and basically say if you take it, then you take, and you sort of eradicate that pawn on e4. So what white usually does after b5 is to play e5, knight d5, knight takes b5, knight b6, I believe, defending the c4 pawn. And despite the slightly weird appearance of this whole line, for black that is, it actually is fairly playable. And again, this is another line where I'm if he actually knows how to play this, which to be honest, I'm not sure he really does. I think that it's sort of a game of he knows I don't really play this because he said after the game, yeah, I saw that you've never played knight c3 in your life before, pretty much. At least from the games in the database, right? Which is pretty spot on. And basically, d takes c4 is a way to try and capitalize on that, where if you really want to get an advantage against d takes c4, you're probably going to have to play e4 and then really prove you know what you're doing. And to be honest, it might just be a little bit easier for black, for example, in these lines, if both players don't really know the theory because they actually have a material advantage. And by the way, I should explain one of the real tricks in my preparation behind going knight c3, which is that if bishop e7, I was planning on going g3, which is sort of like a Catalan, which is what I usually play, except I've played this early knight c3, and given that Felix against Catalan often likes to go for these, at least from what I've seen, bishop b4 check lines, I would be sort of taking him out of his comfort zone by doing this, which is ultimately again why I believe at least he ended up playing d takes e4, so I play e3 instead of e4, which is a bit of a sort of unambitious move because now after a6, if you just take back, black is going to equalize fairly easily by going knight d7 c5, and to be honest, I'm not really a big fan of this position for white. So what I ended up doing actually is to play a4, preventing b5, and after c5, only now taking back on c4, and after takes, we reach a very important structure of which pretty much the whole battle of this game is going to revolve around, which is the isolated queen's pawn. And the reason I went for this, by the way, is that like I was weighing up all my options. I spent a bit of time thinking here before playing e3 and ultimately decided, okay, like this is too risky going for e4 because I'm not going to know the theory. And then after e3 there's a branching point where after a6 I can either take immediately or go a4. I felt that if I played bishop takes c4, like this is very safe, but it's just very difficult to imagine create many chances here. But if I go a4, I can at the very least after this sort of position get an isolated queen's pawn, and there's not like really that much hardcore theory here, which I thought would be good against a player like Felix, who again I feel like is quite theoretical, and I felt given that he's a bit younger, might not have the best strategic understanding of these isolated queen's pawns positions. And of course, while I'm not saying he has like a bad understanding of chess or whatever, definitely my assumption had some merit to it, and I ended up getting a pretty decent position. So bishop b4 already I wasn't really sure about. I thought that the bishop sort of just goes to e7 because on b4 it's like, okay, you pin the knight, but I'm of the opinion that it's not really that useful to do so in this position, especially after we just castle. But okay, we see castles and I play bishop g5, developing my bishop outside the pawn chain. I should also note after c5 that I think after bishop takes c4, Felix didn't have to play takes because that did allow my bishop to get opened up on this diagonal. Whereas, you know, if you play knight c6 and you say we play the same moves, it's not that trivial for white to play a move because our bishop is shut out. Maybe we can take on c5 or something, but that feels pretty dry to be honest. So yeah, I thought that would have maybe been a slight improvement upon the game, but okay. Bishop g5 is what we see here. And Felix plays this move knight bd7, which to be honest, I didn't think was that great. And the reason is I thought you should put the knight in c6 and directly pressure the d4 pawn, because very often when you play against the isolated queen's pawn, well, a lot of players are going to try and play like maybe knight b6 to knight d5 and try and blockade it, because there's sort of the three well-known steps, right, that were laid out a long time ago when you play against the isolated pawn, which is first you want to blockade it, then you want to attack it, and then you want to take it. Something like that at least. And while there definitely is some merit to that, specifically using this knight to go from, you know, d7 to b6 and then d5, well, it does block the IQP. It also has the drawback in that you lose a lot of the pressure on d4 pawn, which very often gives what many players would call white a free hand, where white basically has the freedom to play a lot more actively for their pieces. For example, like this knight on e5 no longer has to really be tied to defending the d4 pawn. It can go to e5, we can play like, in a very optimistic situation, maybe even f4, f5. I'll actually show an example very soon right now of how this can happen. So this is a known classical game played by Michal Botvinnik, and we have a Queen's Gambit decline, the bishop g5 variation, but ends up transposing into an IQP structure where now knight b6 is played, and basically his idea is to again blockade the d5 square in this fashion. But after bishop b3, just retreating, bishop d7, queen d3, knight bd5, knight e5. Again, what we have is a position where white has this sort of free hand, and black really struggles in this position because of the fact that they don't actually really have an active plan apart from just putting their pieces on d5 and pretending that it's doing something. So bishop c6, rook a1, knight b4, and obviously our queen is attacked, so we want to move it. Botvinnik put it on this very active h3 square, attacking various weak points in black's position. They might also have to be watching out for some sort of sacrifices in f7, followed by, like, again, queen takes e6 maybe. And what Botvinnik's opponent decided to do at this point was he decided to bring the bishop to d5, but unfortunately in this position, trading off the pieces, well, generally speaking, that is what you want to do, just really falls short, because after f4 now, trying to increase the pressure on this diagonal by sort of weakening the e6 point, which helps blockade d5, really is just very already not good for white, to put it bluntly. And yeah, Botvinnik won a pawn, and eventually in this position just causes his opponent to resign, because there's simply no way that you can defend against all these threats. By the way, if after rook d6 he takes, then the rook here is going to hang. So coming back to this game, that's sort of what I had in mind when I saw knight b7. Immediately I'm thinking of some sort of position when knight comes to d5, I get knight e5, and like, okay, maybe they go for this bishop d7 c6 thing. I at some point maybe manage to get an f4, f5, and I have a very nice attacking sort of posture, maybe you could say. But I felt that, like, in this position, that probably what black was going to do, actually, if they had the choice, was not to go knight b6, knight d5, bishop d7, bishop c6, but actually play b6, bishop b7, and develop the bishop onto this diagonal, which is why I played my next move, queen b3, and after bishop e7, which was, of course being attacked by my queen. I played rook a-d1, and my basic point was that by getting this tempo in with queen b3, I felt this was quite important because then I'm just in time, I felt, to really stop this whole idea of b6, because now I can break with the isolated queen's pawn with d5. And this really shows the danger, right, of what can happen if you don't properly control this break. If you don't control it properly, all sorts of mayhem can be unleashed onto the position, and this is precisely what we had here. But in actuality, according to the engines at least, after knight b7, there was no real rush, I guess, to like try and prepare this d5 or like play queen b3, because like let's say rook e1, b6, I could actually still go queen b3, kick the bishop out, and after bishop e7 still get d5. I thought it was kind of important to have this rook on the d file so that after knight c5, like after these exchanges happen, there's like a rook staring at the queen, but apparently that doesn't matter too much and white still has an advantage. But okay, nonetheless, queen b3, it's not a terrible move. It's also like maybe not the ideal square for the queen, I must say. Usually I feel like you want to put it on d3 so that like when you later bring this bishop back to b3, let's say, you can come to c2 and you sort of form a battery on this diagonal. But okay, bishop e7, rook a-d1, knight b6, controlling the d5 square. Of course, I don't want to lose this bishop, so I bring it back. Knight f d5, already one of the first surprising moves of the game. I was sort of expecting this knight to come to d5. This one also makes some sense though, because you're trying to initiate some sort of exchange. Like if I just take here, knight takes e7 probably, and you've accomplished one exchange of minor pieces, which of course when you have the isolated queen's pawn as the side defending against it, you usually want to exchange minor pieces. I should also note they have to be a little bit careful, because like if queen takes e7, then there's going to be a5, and this is not so good, because if they like retreat, I'm just winning material, and if they take and go for something like this, then we can like go c4 maybe and use our improved structure after b takes c3 to really cause some harm to the black pieces. But I'll also admit after knight of d5, I was also thinking of playing this move h4, which has a simple idea that if they take after h takes g5, this is a very annoying pawn to deal with, because in many positions, for example, we can play g3, king g2, rook h1, attack that pawn, and it's not really simple how they're going to defend it. However, the reason I didn't play h4 was that I was kind of a bit concerned, like if they just played h6, that, like let's say we have takes inserted, I wasn't really sure if I was benefiting from this at all, because I thought like maybe this is just a weakness, but as it turns out, the computers actually think this is a bit of improvement upon the other variation, I guess, because h6 maybe creates some weaknesses around the king. Things like why it's better if they go like knight e5 or bishop b1, then like queen c2. I guess one of the points is that like if we ever form that battery and they go g6, it's always a lot easier to crack down with h5, because when we do that, they can't recapture back neatly on g6 with their h-pawn. But okay, what I ended up doing was I ended up bringing my bishop all the way back to c1 to avoid the trade, because again, as a usually saying goes, like, or maybe it's not even the saying, but the wisdom is that you sort of want to avoid trades. Felix after the game thought this was, to use his words, a bit extravagant, but it's certainly a reasonable approach, and definitely for him as well, the best move was not trivial, let's say, where the computer wants to go a5, but I understand why he doesn't want to do this. It's like you weaken the b5 square quite a bit, but at the same time, you also make it a lot easier to maintain this blockade on the d5 square. Like for example, if he goes bishop d7, this is something he always has to think about. Like he cannot just easily develop the bishop because he's going to run into a5. If you move the knight somewhere, you're going to lose a pawn, either this way or this way. And if after a5 they go knight takes e3 and then they like play this sort of thing, I'm not sure we want to take, because then we hang one of these pawns. But instead of that, we can go like for example c4 on knight e5, and they can't take this because then they hang the bishop on d7. So after bishop c1, Felix went for a bit of a strange idea where he ended up going for knight b4. But the thing was, despite him doing this like whole zigzaggy thing with his knights, I played bishop b1 next, again avoiding my light squared bishop, a very, very important attacking piece from getting taken. He brings another knight to d5, and I was just like thinking, dude, like what's this guy doing? He's brought this knight to b4, where I'm not really sure what it's doing. Then he brought this other one to d5, and I thought like to begin with maybe you could have just gone knight d5, but what Felix was really aiming for was that he wanted to play this move b6, and he finally was able to do that after knight 65, knight e5, b6. And I continued after some thinking with this slightly unorthodox looking knight e2 move. I was also thinking in the game maybe like knight takes d5, But to be honest, I wasn't really so sure in the event of doing this. And by the way, my idea was not to just exchange pieces, but to bring the queen to h3, very quickly attack the h7 point when, like, okay, if they go g6, bishop h6, I have a very nice initiative, but I was thinking, like, if they go f5, for example, bishop b7 next, I'm not actually sure I have that amazing of an attack here, and I thought black maybe is not doing all that bad. But instead, again, after b6, I end up going for a continuation, which was maybe a bit too ambitious, where I went knight e2, and basically my idea was that I want to go queen h3, but I don't want to trade a pair of knights in the process. I felt that by keeping these knights on b4 and d5, they're sort of a bit awkward on the edge of the board, in particular this one here. Whereas if I exchanged one of them off, then, like, in essence, I felt like I was helping them sort of re-coordinate some of their pieces, although they're probably not going to go knight takes d5. I thought queen takes d5 is a bit more natural, but at a later point could maybe bring the knight back to d5, and they're not going to have both knights sort of tripping over each other's feet, so to speak. But the issue of knight e2 is it's sort of a bit, like, objectively it's okay, but I kind of just lose a bit of steam. And after bishop g5, which I wasn't really so sure about in the game, I was provoked into playing this move f4, which objectively maybe wasn't that great. Maybe I should just go queen h3, waiting to see either g6 or f5 on the board. If f5, then, like, I've provoked some weaknesses now on dark squares, I can argue. Whereas with what I went for in the game, now after f4, bishop e7, I gain a tempo, but now if I go queen h3, f5, while I have created some weaknesses in the dark squares, I've also created some weaknesses of my own through playing this move f4, and I think from afar I really overestimated the sort of attacking potential I might have in this sort of position, and got a bit frustrated, maybe you could say, when things started to not really turn out how I wanted them to go. And like, in comparison, like, say this position again with this one, the reason this one is better is because, like, we've provoked black to play f5, but we even played f4, creating any of our own weaknesses. So yeah, okay, what I tried to do was, instead of going queen h3, I decided to play g4, with the idea, hopefully, that after f5, that by having this g pawn involved in the attack, there would be extra firepower to throw black and somehow stir up some sort of crazy stuff. Didn't actually work well though, and things ended up going downhill very quickly from here as I started spending too much time on my next few moves. Okay, f2, sort of maybe preparing to bring the rook g2 in some variations. I was even fantasizing about some, like, h4 pawn sacrifice followed by rook h2, which objectively is not very good, but after bishop d6, which came fairly quickly from Felix, I basically just crumbled, and it's very embarrassing what happened here, but I played knight f3 after, like, more than 10 minutes of thinking, with the basic idea that if I want to transfer my knight to g5, pound on the e6 pawn, and if they play f takes g4, like, again, I'm going to do this, and actually when the pawn disappears, like, this diagonal is actually very soft, it looks like. But actually there's a problem in this line, and just in this whole concept as a whole, which is that I was banking on the fact that after, like, they take on f4, takes, I'm winning 2 pieces for the rook. That is after they go knight h3 check, here, take, like, again, 2 pieces of the rook, but I was just very lazy in calculating and did not bother to look further and see that after f takes g4, I can't move my knight because my king is on f2, right? And so I'm actually just losing in this position straight up, which is why after bishop takes f4, I quickly had to course correct and not take back on f4 and pretty much just be down a pawn with a weak king, objectively losing, and with very little hope of survival. I'm not going to spend too much time going over the rest of these moves because, quite frankly, it was just a complete shit show pretty much. And to be honest, I've noticed this sort of tendency in myself sometimes when I get to a position, sometimes against stronger players, usually it is, I just, like, self-destruct. I have, like, way too big expectations of what my position is supposed to be like, and what is, like, should otherwise be, like, a fairly just complicated position. I think what I should have gone for was takes, rook g2. I should also note something that actually, the reason I didn't play g takes f5 was I really had a very strange misevaluation of this position where I felt that after takes, and, like, if I put my bishop here, they're just going to go bishop e6, control the light squares very nicely, blockade my sort of point in the center, and despite the sort of dark square weaknesses around the king, I felt that black actually had quite good play, but this was just wrong as it turns out. I said this after the game to my opponent. He was just like, dude, like, what are you talking about? This is good for white. The engine also completely disagrees with me, so yeah, I don't know. It's one of these weird quirks I have in my evaluation system, you could say, where sometimes I just evaluate stuff weirdly, but especially when it comes to these sorts of, like, positions where one side is attacking. But okay, like, yeah, knight f3 though, like I can have whatever evaluations I want here. The thing that upset me though was just that how lazy I wasn't calculating this. I spent like more than 10 minutes and I couldn't even see like this simple idea with after takes and knight h3 here, and then the end of this f takes g4. So honestly, a bit of a strange game, and I'm not really sure what the moral of the story is, to be honest. Like, there were some small moments earlier, like, okay, sure, I go h4, like maybe in this position I don't go knight e2, but of course what really killed me was just the fact that maybe f4 you could say also wasn't the best, but I was way too optimistic. I just was really going for it, and then like in this position started retreating. It's like I can have the perspective to say that, like, from a mentality perspective, this makes no sense, but it was the only reason I was going backwards because I was misevaluating a lot of these structural changes after takes in this line with g takes f5, and I was seeing some other weird stuff in the game. I think I might have also been a bit concerned about like queen h4, and I felt like I had to do something about that immediately. Queen h4 was not the sole reason I played knight f3, but yeah, this sort of game, I haven't had this for a while. I used to have this a lot more when I was a bit younger. When I hit 2200 for the first time, I still had games like this against like IMs and stuff where I'd be doing fine the whole game and then I'd just like blow myself up for no reason. Hasn't happened for like this badly in a while, but definitely, yeah, something to work on. But anyways, hope you guys found this useful and hopefully have learned something maybe about the isolated pawn or how to not kill yourself on the chessboard. But yeah, anyways, hope you guys have a good one.